Our pilgrims come with verdicts in hand. That's what Mark Twain wrote in one of his lesser-known works entitled Innocents Abroad. People begin with their verdicts, Twain says, and then go looking for the evidence. In this work, Twain is stationed somewhere in the Promised Land, not far from the Sea of Galilee, and he's observing the pilgrims that come from all over the world on some visit or experience to the Holy Land. They come with their expectations. Twain says they come with their romanticized notions of how this part of the world was supposed to look. Many of them come with their pretty pictures that have been imprinted in their Bibles, or they come with what they imagined of the Holy Land from Sunday school class when they were a child, imagining beautiful landscapes and breathtaking vistas. The only problem with all this, Twain says, is that it ain't there. It's ugly. The Holy Land is ugly, Twain argues. He says, and I quote, "The whole scene proves to be only an unobtrusive basin of water, a mountainous desolation, and one tree," unquote. And so he begins to question why these travelers, these pilgrims, can't see the reality, the stark reality of the Holy Land. And he concludes that all too often we only see what we expect to see. Later in the book he writes, and I quote, "I'm sure from the tenor of books I've read that many who have visited this land in years gone by were Presbyterians and came seeking evidences in support of their particular creed. They found a Presbyterian Palestine, and they had already made up their minds to find no other, though possibly they did not know it, being blinded by their zeal. Others were Baptists, seeking Baptist evidences and a Baptist Palestine. Others were Catholics, Methodists, Episcopalians, seeking evidences, endorsing their several creeds, and a Catholic, a Methodist, and an Episcopalian Palestine. Honest as these men's intentions may have been, they were full of partialities and prejudices. They entered the country with their verdicts already prepared, and they could do no more, and they could no more write dispassionately and impartially about it than they could about their own wives and children. Our pilgrims have brought their verdicts with them," unquote. You can hear what he's saying. We see what we expect to see. We don't just receive meaning, we create meaning. We pilgrims tend to travel with our verdicts already at hand. And too many times, rather than believe the truth, we create our own truth. It's quite a scene in John 18. The Jewish religious leaders have brought Jesus before Pilate, the Roman prefect, in hopes of having Jesus crucified. They wanted Jesus crucified because they thought he was a lie. Some quack from Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Jesus had never been to seminary. He said things that challenged the status quo. He interpreted the Scriptures differently than they did. And therefore, they concluded that he didn't believe the Scriptures at all, which is always very convenient. He made friends with sinners, which must indicate, they thought, that he had made friends with sin. He challenged the authorities when the authorities thought they were ordained by God. And therefore, to challenge the authorities was an affront to the authority of God Almighty. He crossed boundaries of race and religion and nationality and ideology, oftentimes in one lone scene, like John 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well. All those boundaries were how most people made sense of their lives. And Jesus didn't think twice about overstepping them. It seemed like in every chapter he was creating chaos upon chaos. Jesus believed that people were more important than piety. The Jewish leaders thought piety is what made them a people. Finally, and maybe most importantly of all, some people claimed that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, before this time, there had been other Messiahs. There had been many Messiahs spring up here and spring up there, insurrection here and insurrection there, Jewish peasant revolt here, Jewish peasant revolt there. But the same thing happened every time. Eventually, Rome, the might, the power of Rome arrived. And the iron grip of Rome tightened around the Jewish people. They squashed the revolt, oftentimes with great bloodshed and violence, and things grew worse for the Jewish people. No more messiahs. We've had enough of messiahs. And so, they knew Jesus was a lie because He disagreed with them, and they had the truth, and so they wanted to rid themselves of this lie, and they brought Jesus to Pilate. Now, Pilate was a politician at this point, but he wasn't really a politician. Pilate was a military man who happened into a political position. Pilate was a hard man, known for his greed and his cruelty and his inflexibility. In AD 26, Pilate brought in to Jerusalem Roman standards with the image of the emperor carved into them. Jewish people felt very strongly about images, and you can imagine how the Jewish people responded to this. And when Pilate called in soldiers to squash the revolt in Jerusalem, the Jews bore their necks to receive the swords of the Roman soldiers. Pilate relented. No mass homicide. That'd look bad in Rome. And so Pilate changed his mind, removed the standards. On another occasion, Pilate wanted to build an aqueduct, but he lacked funds. And so he began to dip into the temple treasury. He stole sacred funds from the temple. When the Jewish people found out about this, you can imagine how angry they were. A crowd gathered in protest. And so Pilate had his soldiers dress up as civilians. And upon his cue, the soldiers disrobed and began to beat the crowd viciously with clubs. Just two stories. Pilate was a ruthless, hard leader who believed in the truth of power and the truth of force. And as the Roman authority of the region, Pilate was the only one who could authorize a crucifixion. And so the Jews brought Jesus to him. Pilate began the trial in typical fashion. What charges do you bring against this man? Did you hear how they responded? If he hadn't done anything wrong, we wouldn't have brought him to you. There are no charges. They don't have a charge against him. They know he's guilty. They just don't know of what charge yet. Judge him yourselves, Pilate says. He has greater issues to deal with than some intra-Jewish theological controversy. Pilate doesn't care. But we can't crucify him, the Jewish leaders reply, revealing their true intent all along. They have reached their verdict with no evidence. Frankly, when you have cemented your verdict, what matters? The evidence. Pilate walks back inside the praetorium to question Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? It's a loaded question. In those days, Herod the Great had claimed that title. This is a loaded question. Jesus said, did you come up with that all by yourself, or did someone else give you that question? I'm not a Jew. I don't know. I don't care, Pilate says. My kingdom's not of this world, which has been misinterpreted ever since Jesus spoke it, I think. It doesn't mean Jesus' kingdom is otherworldly and has nothing to do with this world, that all Jesus cares about is heaven. That's not what it means. Jesus' kingdom is very this worldly, but it's not like the other kingdoms of the world. In many ways, it's the antithesis of all the kingdoms of the world. My kingdom is not like your kingdoms. Oh, so you are a king, Pilate quips. Yes. I came to bear witness to the truth, and anyone who hears my voice, anyone who loves the truth, listens to my voice. And then Pilate asks, what is truth? I don't know about you, but when Pilate asked that question, I can almost feel the time-space continuum begin to crack a little. When Pilate asked that question, I can almost feel our ancestors sit up in their graves to listen to the response. The angelic chorus grows silent to hear what the answer is. What is truth? It's not a question just asked in philosophy classrooms. It's a question asked by children in living rooms. It's not just asked in abstract thought, it's asked in doctors' offices and political dialogues. It doesn't just impact PhDs, it impacts the least of these. What is truth? You know, we live in a day where people are leery of the truth of the truth. People are leery of the concept of truth. We live in a day that sociologists and philosophers call postmodernism. It's really a philosophical movement that began with the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche and has somehow ended up in our brains, in our living rooms, and our sanctuaries. Radical postmodernists reject the idea of big T truth. There is no absolute truth, postmodernists say. There's only relative truth. Truth is always perspectival. There is no big T truth. There's only your truth and my truth. And therefore, how can you challenge my truth? It's my truth. And how can I challenge your truth? It's your truth. Which leads to rampant pluralism and that sort of stuff. While I don't come to the same conclusions as postmodernists, and I think they're way off base and lead to absurdities in some ways, I do share some of the concerns of postmodernism. Take science, for example. How many times has the scientific truth of one age become the mockery of the next? The world was flat. You know the world was flat. There was scientific validation that the world was flat. Open your eyes, and the world is flat. Anybody who lives with their eyes open can see that the world's not round. We don't roll ourselves to work. We drive, we walk, the world is flat. We knew it. And we kicked people out of the church for saying otherwise. And worse. And then one day we said, oh, new data, experimentation, technology arrives, science changes. One generation's theory of relativity is the next generation's quantum physics. And are eggs good for you or not? I'm confused. It's changed 15 times in my lifetime. I don't know anymore. One generation's scientific truth is the next generation's joke. There have been times where yesterday's scientific dogma has faded in today's light. This generation tends to think that truth is just a product of power, a sword in the hand of those who rule over us. Political powers create the truths that sustain their platforms. The right has a study which leads to these statistics. And the left has a similar study which has led to these statistics. The right believes that this legislation has a positive effect, and the left believes the very same legislation has a negative effect. How long do you listen to this kind of stuff before you begin to believe that none of the powers care about truth, they care about control, and thus they create their own truths? To borrow a South African proverb, when giant elephants wrestle, it's the grass that suffers. Even history. We all tend to think that history is objective. History is telling the story of what really happened. But have you ever read the history of the American Revolution from a British perspective? History is not what really happened. History is one person or one group's perspective of what really happened. And those who write our history books, those who tell our historical stories, don't just control where we've been, they tend to control where we're going to, which is why we argue about history. Over and over again, this generation has seen people cloak their own perceptions as the truth. And oftentimes, people create universal truths to legitimize particular interests. Might I confess, I've seen this in churches and religious institutions as well. People confuse their doctrines with God's truth as if everything about God has been settled. Faith is equated with certainty, and therefore doubt is the ultimate enemy. Any new notion of God, any new notion of truth is squeezed out. No new interpretations of Scripture. We have a bad habit of reading the living Scriptures, the breathing, inspired Scriptures, as if they're dead. You see, if the church possesses the truth, if the church has a monopoly on the truth, then anyone who differs with the church differs with the truth. And therefore we can cast them out or throw them in prison or burn them at the stake and have a good conscience about it. Many times over, the church has used the truth as a weapon against heretics, a weapon against other religions, a weapon against those who differ with us. But when truth is used as a weapon, it always seems like a product of power. I have had a good number of people say to me, "Preston, preach the truth." And really what they mean is come out swinging from the pulpit. That's really what they mean. I've always thought that when people walk out of the church with black eyes and bloody lips and broken hearts because of what the preacher said, then the truth no longer feels like good news. I see two dangers at work simultaneously in this passage. First of all, I see the danger of the Jewish crowd adopting a mob mentality. If you say something loud enough and often enough, angrily enough, it will become truth. And people absorb it without even thinking about it. But it seems to me that the truth most often comes in the form of a whisper and not a shout. I'm very leery of people who have no doubts about the truth because it so often coincides with their own self-interest. May we be reminded today, and be reminded often, that what crucified Jesus in the Gospel of John, what crucified Jesus was not the doubts of the skeptics, but the certainty of the people of God. It was the madness of a mob that didn't need evidence because they already had their certitude, they already had their verdict in hand. It was the bullheaded, stringent certitude of people whose biblical interpretation and religious practices placed them on the wrong side of the cross. And that sort of religion does exist. There is a sort of religion that doesn't need faith because it offers certainty. There is a sort of religion that prevents dialogue and shuts down conversation rather than opening them. There is a sort of religion that refuses to listen to the other because it's so engorged on its own way of thinking. This is the sort of religion that Jesus opposed at every turn in His living, and the sort of religion that He exposed for its evil in His dying. Not one of us, brothers and sisters, has a monopoly on the truth. Can I say that again? Not one of us. No preacher, no politician, no author, no philosopher, no talking head, not one of us has a monopoly on the truth. And when we pretend as if we do, we're a short step away from causing very great harm. On the other hand, you've got the ditch on the other side of the road. You've got Pilate, who asked the great question, but doesn't stick around for the answer. Did you notice that? Did you read how the text reads? Pilate asked the question, what is truth? And then the very next statement, it says, when he had said this, he went out again. When he had said this, he went out again. Pilate asked the great question, but then he leaves the room. And the question goes unanswered. Pilate left. Maybe it was because he was a pre-postmodernist. A postmodernist before postmodernism was cool, and he believed there was no answer to that question. Maybe it was because he had important things to do, like Roman business. Maybe he was more concerned about the energy of the crowd than the questions of Jesus. Maybe. I think it's this. I think Pilate looked down his long nose of power at Jesus. And he looked into the eyes of this poor man from Nazareth who stood there weak and in chains. And as a man who had been rooted in Roman power, was very, very unimpressed. Even if Jesus was speaking the truth, Pilate wasn't interested because Jesus was weak. And what does truth matter in the presence of power? Pilate only cared about the truth of power. Jesus lived His life bearing witness to the power of truth. And before you can truly search for the truth, you've got to be willing to find it. You get the feeling that Pilate wouldn't have recognized the truth if it was standing right in front of him, having a conversation with him. You see, according to the Bible, truth isn't about abstract ideas. Truth in the Scriptures is personal. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am. For us, truth is no creed. It's no doctrinal system. For us, truth is Jesus. Truth is not a what, it's a who. And we only know the truth to the extent that we relate to this one person. Knowing the truth isn't just about ideas, it's about character, Jesus-like character. And thus, if I could borrow a phrase from one of my favorite theologians, while we must be willing to die for the truth, we must never sacrifice others on the altar of our truth. While we must be willing to die for the truth, we must never sacrifice others on the altar of our truth. We must be humble enough to be open to truth that will change us, wherever that truth is found. For all truth is God's truth. Whether it comes from test tubes or history books or relationships or experiences, all truth is God's truth. We must be willing to give a fair hearing to contrarian views. And we must be willing to submit to truth whenever and wherever we do discover it. You see, it's not so much whether or not we can grasp the truth. That wasn't the question in the Praetorium that day. It's not whether or not we can grasp the truth. It's whether or not we are willing to be grasped by the truth. And Pilate wasn't going to be grasped by anything. Earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus said, "They," as in His followers, "will know the truth, and the truth will make them free." Free. Not imprisoned, not constrained, not small-minded. The truth will make them free. Pilate wasn't free that day. It looked like it, but he wasn't. You would think he would be the most powerful man in the region and all, but Pilate wasn't free. He was just a puppet of Rome. He was so solidified in the ways of power that he was only concerned with whether or not this would cause him to lose his job. You get the feeling that although it was Jesus standing before Pilate, Pilate was the one on trial. And the crowd wasn't free either. They were caught up in a cauldron of groupthink and misguided fury. They were in a hurry to rid themselves of a truth so potent it challenged everything about their reality, which is why they felt safer releasing a violent, insubordinate insurrectionist named Barabbas who had been convicted of killing than a truth-telling, peacemaking rabbi. They were more comfortable with Barabbas killing than Jesus living. The crowd was imprisoned by their expectations and their anger. They were imprisoned by their verdict. The day at the Praetorium, in an ironic twist, the only person who was truly free was the one who was in chains. And He can make you free too. And me free too. Free enough to tell the truth, even if it means we drop our verdicts every now and then. Free enough to love the truth. Free enough to live the truth. What is truth? That question went unanswered that day at the Praetorium. Or maybe the question was answered. But it was answered, as it so often is, at a level that's deeper than words. For amidst the shouts of the crowds and the scoffs of Pilate stood a king who was not of this world, who was initiating a kingdom which is not of this world. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like foolishness, sheer folly, weakness, a hoax, a lie. But that's because He was and is the truest truth the world has ever seen. We can't think our way to it. We can only receive it. And so, what is truth? Our words don't answer that question. Our lives do. And so, it's time to pray. On the eve of school starting back, it's time to pray. In a moment, Randall's going to come and tell us how. I want to explain the why. First of all, for the students in the room, we want to pray for you. Because knowledge can be gained. Knowledge can be gained through reading good books and listening to good teachers. But wisdom cannot be gained. It can only be received. And so we pray that as you grow in knowledge, you also grow in wisdom. That as you read good books and think good thoughts, you don't forget to pray good prayers. We will pray that you are open to truth wherever it is found. In science, in math, in social studies, in philosophy. Be open to truth wherever it's found, because all truth is God's truth. We need not be afraid of it. We will pray for teachers and administrators and coaches who have some of the most important jobs in all the world, to whom we trust our greatest natural resources. And we'll pray for all of us that we grow towards Jesus, because truth isn't just what our minds think. Truth is also what our character is. May we be more like Him.